Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Beaver. I retired as a local in 2013. I was a polygraph examiner in Tupelo Reading. I was also a crime guy there for 2 years prior to polygraph. I'm here to talk to you today about how I got to meet Dr. Perlin. I meet Dr. Perlin because it was a homicide in May of 2008. Homicide. This was Kathy Lyons. Kathy Lyons was a 45-year-old lady from the area of the South Mountains in Lebanon County. She lived in a home that was a beautiful log cabin home. The property was beautiful, and I would drive there. Of course, after the fact, there were all these deer running around, horses running around. She lived in a home that many people died for. But she did. This home should have been in magazines. Her husband, Bob, was a contractor. All we were working. There was still her path with a gentleman named Glenn Lyons intersected in about 2007. Glenn Lyons was kind of the opposite. He never had anything in life. What he got, he stole. He was a career criminal. Convicted in Philadelphia of numerous armed robberies. Recall at the time of the trial, they went back over his death penalty case. Ultimately, they went back over his schooling and the notes that his teachers gave. They basically weren't given Glenn a much older life after about third grade. Their paths intersected at a place called Net Kansas, which is in Berks County. They both worked there, both met there. And an affair resulted, and they became involved in a sexual relationship. May 1st, 2008, Kathy Lyons leaves her home about 9 o'clock in the morning. Leaves the crock pot on. Leaves the dog there. Her husband is at work again. Things are ever served. Her husband alibis out in the time that she was killed. Kathy Lyons goes and meets Glenn Lyons at one of their normal meeting places, which is a parking area for the Waterville State Hospital. Kathy doesn't return home that evening. Her husband surprisingly did not report her missing that evening, which kind of throws up a red flag for us as investigators right away. And when he's asked to give an explanation why he didn't, he says he thought you had to wait 24 hours to report somebody missing. It's kind of like the old school, the way it was. Turns out he was factual in that account. That's why he didn't report missing. Friday morning, he reports him missing to the local police department. They pretty much asked us right away to get involved in the investigation of the smell. Get involved. First thing we do is we get cell records. And we find out two things. We find out that her cell phone is paying off the power in Lebanon City. And we find out that there are numerous calls preceding this back and forth between her and this guy named Glenn Lyons. Glenn Lyons on our radar from the start. I'm not quite sure that anything really bad has fallen out yet. We do the investigation from the start. Twitter photo on TV. Got all the local police departments in Lebanon City looking for the vehicle, her, whatever the case might be. And the fire has everything came on. On Sunday, we May 4th, about noontime, we get a call at the station that she's been located in her vehicle on the property of Waterville State Hospital. She's been located by her husband. And we find out that a neighbor of his had been driving by and said, yeah, it looks like Kathy's vehicle over there. Calls him up, Bob goes down, goes and finds Kathy. What we find inside the vehicle is Kathy, obviously deceased, extremely bloody. And she had 30 stab wounds about her upper torso, neck area. back seat of the vehicle, the SUV, was spatter, blood smears, blood. Kathy, we would find out, died a very agonizing death. She was stabbed multiple times, none of which were immediately fatal. She had to see what she was trying to make her way. We're now really magnifying our manhunt on Lyons with the state parolee. Anybody in here from state parole? We call state parole, say, listen, this guy is on the land, he can't get out of the house, he's on the loose. It's got to be something to do for us. Basically what they say to us is, well, we'll send him a letter from the mail and tell him he needs to report. If he doesn't report within a certain number of days, then we'll be able to issue some type of case. Wasn't a real satisfactory answer. And so the DA works down and made a call in practice. Within about a half an hour, they was written to us and we at that point put him in NCIC, and as of Sunday evening, he was in NCIC. The game is afoot, and we're very active. Sunday evening, we interview another lady who identifies herself as Glenn Lyons' girlfriend, and she says she's been in phone contact with Glenn, and he's on the run. So now we really know. Inside the vehicle, by the way, we found 2 steak knives broken off the hilt. That evening, we served a search warrant on Lyons' apartment in Reading City, and we found steak knife was similar to what was found in the vehicle. We catch a couple of really good races. One is on Tuesday, I get a call from an officer in Carroll Township, Dalton County. He said, listen, I've been seeing this guy's photo on the news. I stopped him on Friday night, or Thursday and Friday, May 1st and May 2nd. Stopped him up here. He just got off the turnpike. He was lost. Stopped him, everything checked out. I let him go. Of course, he wasn't in an NCIC then. He had these 3 people in the car with him. 3 people were from Lebanon City. That Tuesday, we go and we track them down. The one gives us very valuable information. His name is Justin Root. Basically, he hooked up with Lyons right after Lyons committed the homicide on Thursday morning, May 1st. And they go on a cocaine binge, crack cocaine binge for 3 days. It goes between Lebanon and Philadelphia. Root says, when he came to Lebanon around noon on May 1st, I saw him deposit bag in the dumpster at a business right near where I was going to get him crack. The group and Lyons had not known each other before May 1st. They literally met in a chance encounter, verified chance encounter on the street corner of Lebanon City for drugs. The group says they saw him dump a package in that dumpster. Immediately go to the business, find out that the dumpster, of course, has been empty. So we prepare for physical land. Good news. It was not a garbage dumpster. It was a recycling dumpster. A recycling cardboard dumpster. Which made everything a lot cleaner. But the recycling cardboard dumpster had been empty and was now a facility, a warehouse, intermixed with literally thousands and thousands of tons of other recycling products. Shout out at this point to a member of John Bill Walsh, who heads up a team of cadets from the academy, 40 of them, as I recall. Goes to this recycling facility. For 3 days, this recycling facility shuts down operations. All the forklifts are at our disposal, and we go through every ounce of cardboard in this facility looking for this bag that we knew was mine. Friday afternoon, about noon, Bill Walsh called me up and said, Jim, here's the news. They've been real popular. They're shutting us down at 4 o'clock. We can't do it. Friday afternoon about 2 o'clock, takes Lyons back, interspersed the bag contains capitalized first. This for the sweater. And some other items. Of course, get it back to the barracks. Glenn Lyons was located in Philadelphia on Thursday, May the 8th. He was located by our fugitive squad. One thing I learned about the fugitive squad is never ask them how they find people at the time. Accept them, don't ask any questions. They're never going to get a report, they're never going to see something else. They just find them, get them in. We meet Glenn Lyons in Philadelphia, Bill Moyer and I interview him. And basically, Glenn's story is that he and Captain were having sex in the back of his vehicle. Men wearing yellow hooded sweatshirts broke into the vehicle, pulled him out, beat him unconscious. And while he was unconscious, they did stabbed him. Didn't watch at that time. Unfortunately, that story wasn't watched the first time. To wrap things up, we get this hooded sweatshirt, and my summary, my policeman's summary of what the sweatshirt is, on the cuffs was a lot of blood, that the DNA came back, it was naturally capitalized. That sweatshirt was in the vehicle when the bloodletting took place, when the stabbing took place, because there was very fine blood spatter on the sleeves, and maybe other places on the hooded sweatshirt. The dilemma came when we got the DNA mixture results back. Just identify whose sweatshirt that was. There was a mixture of DNA. That was. And the chances of it being of a random person contributing DNA, other than Glenn Lyons, I know I can say that right, Dr. Perlin, was 1 in 42,000. Now at that time, I'm a Phillies fan, and I equated 1 in 42,000 to being 1 in People and Citizens Bank Department, about 45. And I didn't really like those odds. But it's what we had. I go to polygraph school in January 2009, talking to a trooper from Al Rescue, Jim Brown. Jim Brown was familiar with the whole thing. Jim Brown gave Dr. Perlin's information. He gave Dr. Perlin's information. John Perlin, who was very, very sharp assistant district attorney in Berks County. They met, they talked, and my number went from 142,000 to 1 bunch of zeros, and that made me much happier person. That's how I got to meet Dr. Perlin. Let me tell you about Dr. Perlin's courtroom presentation. The thing that impressed me most about Dr. Perlin is he could talk to me. We had a 20-minute conversation one day in the courthouse. He could talk to me as a man with all these degrees. And I could understand. When he talked to the jury in Berks County, I watched the jury, waiting to see what they're going to do. They understood. They listened, they were attentive, and Dr. Perlin's presentation. And they said what was going on. That was very, as a prosecutor, as a trooper, very important to me that he could relate to the story. He did. My Lyons was convicted of first-degree murder. Lyons is sitting where he was served when he belongs. Any questions? Thanks for your time.
Thanks again. So, let me pick up from where Trooper Weaver left off. This is the evidence. It's a sweatshirt and blood spatter, and there's DNA mixture evidence in the back of the collar. That was 75% of the victim and 25% of someone else. And this was degraded DNA, so what I thought I would do is take 5 minutes and tell you about what degraded DNA is. I'm sure you've heard of it, and it's not that hard to explain. Suppose we have a DNA molecule. It has some length, and we want to measure it and run it through this short tandem repeat assay in the laboratory. The way the amplification works is that if you have an intact sentence of DNA, the enzyme that copies the DNA, it's called DNA polymerase, it makes copies of the DNA, needs to read through that entire sentence without any breaks. And if it can read through, it'll copy from both ends, and then you'll get 2 strands. And then it repeats. And then you get 4 and 8 and 16 and 32, 64. And after about 28 cycles, you have tens of millions of copies of DNA. But in order to do the copying, that whole paragraph has to be in place without any breaks. And when you do that, if you look at all these different locations, each of these boxes, this is data from the Pennsylvania State Police, corresponds to a different location from a chromosome. And if you look at the signals that you're getting, you see that the heights, the peaks, are pretty much the same. There's no fall off. There's no problem in reading short strands or reading long strands. The sentences can be very short or very long, and you're getting good copying, and there's no issue. That's a normal DNA signal. With degraded DNA, there are breaks or cuts in the DNA strand. They can be caused by many things. It's usually by bacteria that have enzymes that cut the DNA. It can be due to other things, more exotically, like radiation and so on. But the point of it is, once there's a break in the paragraph, the enzyme can't copy through it anymore. So 1 cut, 2 cuts, 3 cuts, as soon as there's a single cut that degrades the DNA into smaller fragments, the experiment doesn't work, and you can't copy that DNA. It doesn't work. Okay. Now, this is the key concept of degraded DNA from the laboratory's perspective. If you have a very short fragment of DNA, a very short sentence, then the chance of having a cut in it is a lot less than if you have a longer piece of DNA. And the reason is the chance of a cut is the same, for every 100 letters. It's going to be the same chance. The longer the molecule is, the more of a chance that you'll get at least 1 cut. And so what happens is that when scientists set up these experiments, they set up to look at short paragraphs from one locus, mid-size paragraphs from other loci, and then much longer paragraphs that read out all the way for large sizes, all in the same experiment. So they're all there together. And what you'll see is that the larger DNA paragraphs start falling off. They decay because there's more of a chance that there's a cut. What you get is a decay curve. The longer the DNA size, the smaller the peak heights. And you can see that on this data, which is actually from the same case, where you start off with a certain height of DNA for shorter fragments, and then as the paragraphs get longer, the heights fall off until finally you don't see them at all. So that's what degraded DNA looks like. The DNA gets chopped up with more of a chance of a cut as the molecule gets longer, and there's a decay pattern in the data. And when you have a mixture, that means that you may have one individual with less degradation, another one with more degradation, and the signals become a lot more complex to interpret. Okay? So this is the data from the Lyons case. And what I'm showing is that this gray curve is just a little bit of degradation from the victim, but that second component, shown in blue, was much more degraded. The computer can account for this, and what it means is that the relative mixing weights are changing as you move from left to right. It looks like there's less of the more degraded component because it relatively falls off as you move from left to right. So this is what I presented to the jury in June of 2011. This was the second case that I had done. It's actually the second time I had presented evidence to a jury, and it was the second case anywhere, but also in Pennsylvania. So I'm just going to show you what I showed the jury. By now, this should seem very familiar, so I won't dwell on things. This is the basic explanation. Starting on the top left, if you have an evidence item, the lab will process that DNA and will produce data. And those data, as you see in the center, have certain alleles, which are sizes, in this case 10, 11, 12, the number of repeats, with different quantities. Here we see more of 12 than of 10 and 11 in this cartoon. And that's reflecting how much of each genotype and each allele is present at each of the 15 genetic loci in the test tube, and we're seeing it as data in front of us. From that evidence data, whether it's a person or a computer, an inference can be made as to what the genotype is. The genotype can be a list of alleles with an inclusion method. It can be an inconclusive if the thresholds for the human review doesn't permit more. Or it can be, for each contributor at each locus, a list of allele pairs with probabilities, which you've seen before. And that's how the uncertainties are represented and how information can be preserved. Once the computer has inferred that genotype, the genotype is the list of allele pairs with those percentages or probabilities for each locus, for each of the contributors, then it writes it down, it's finished, it's objective, it's done, and then, as you see on the bottom right, a comparison can get made to some known genotype. So that's the process of how DNA evidence is interpreted. Computers can use all the data without thresholds. Here we see the quantitative peak heights at locus D8, which is a region, a paragraph on the 8th chromosome. The two tall peaks on the right, 14 and 15, correspond to Kathy Liebig, who's the victim. She's the major contributor to this mixture. And we see another peak at 13 to the left of those victim peaks that look like they come from someone else, but in a smaller quantity, which is why the peak height is smaller. With thresholds, there's an all or none response, and the fact that we know that the victim's genotype are the two tall peaks is not used. And the peaks that are found to be over a threshold, say of a level of 200, are considered to be in, and any peaks that would be underneath would vanish. So the threshold turns the data pattern into all or none events, and it doesn't have to be accurate. Just because you see a peak doesn't mean it's an allele, but it often does, particularly with taller peaks. What the computer does is instead it tries out many possibilities. Here there could be a genotype of a 13 and a 14. That's the other person, along with the victim's genotype shown in gray with a taller allele pair of a 14 and a 15. That's the basic pattern. The computer can do more and say, well, there are other artifacts and imbalances. It accounts for that as well. And the computer will try out 10 or 100,000 different patterns of different heights and different locations to produce a probability distribution. Better explanations of the data, like what you're seeing on top, will produce higher probabilities for genotypes like the 13 and the 14, that little allele pair of that second contributor shown in blue. When it's all done, we have evidence genotypes. At this locus, D8, on the right, we see the victim genotype of the 14 and the 15, those two tall peaks. And now we have the genotype shown in a lighter shade of blue of the other person. And of the 100 possible allele pairs, the data, by considering all the possibilities, has concentrated the probability really onto three possibilities: a 13-13, a 13-14, and a 13-15. The middle one with a higher probability is that 13-14 that we saw here that explained the data very nicely. And that concentration of probability is what actually provides the information. So we have these three possibilities shown in light blue, and then when we compare them with a random person's genotype, shown in brown, and these are 3 of 100 possible allele pairs, we can answer the question of, for the DNA match information, how much more does the suspect match the evidence than a random person? Knowing that now for the first time that Glenn Lyons, at least from the computer's perspective, that the Glenn Lyons DNA profile at the D8 locus has a genotype of a 13-14, we can focus on the 13-14, pretty much ignore the other 100 possible allele pairs, and ask what's the ratio of probabilities of the blue bar from the evidence genotype to the brown bar of the random genotype from the population. And what that gives us is the probability of an evidence match, which is the taller blue bar, divided by the probability of a coincidental match, which is the brown bar at Glenn Lyons' genotype of a 13-14. That ratio is about 6 times more, and therefore at this one locus out of, say, 15 different loci at D8, the match statistic is 6. And then multiplying that 6 times 10 and so on at all the different loci, we can answer the question, is the suspect in the evidence? And so we can state in words, reading right off the math formulas, that a match between the suspect and the evidence is 9.46 trillion times more probable than coincidence, and then answer the question for the court, yes, with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, evidence item Q9, which is the mixture from the sweatshirt, contains DNA from the genotype of suspect item K2, which is Glenn Lyons. We can also answer the question, since this was an abandoned article of clothing, is the victim in the evidence? There's more match information because Kathy Liebig was the major contributor to this mixture, and we can state that a match between the victim and the evidence is 1.27 quintillion times more probable than coincidence. Quintillion is 18 zeros after the 1. And then conclude, yes, with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, evidence item Q9 contains DNA from the genotype of the victim, item K1, and establish that both individuals contributed to this mixture. And just to make it more visual, a number like 9.5 trillion, you're seeing the 12 zeros after the 1, as opposed to the human match result, which has 4 zeros. It's 42,000. So it's the same data, it's the same question, but the computer can make more use of the evidence.